that by any means possible I may attain to the resurrection of the dead. Those are the words that close this passage that we have been working on now for the last 5 Sundays, 6 including today, starting in Philippians chapter 3, verse 1, and now ending in verse 11. And I want to observe something with you. You will notice that I have carved out verse 11 as a separate sermon to itself, and I'm doing that on purpose for a number of reasons. I want to preach just verse 11 by itself. The first reason, and probably the most important, is because I really wanted to preach verse 10 by itself. Okay, I didn't want to have to try to drag into verse 10 what is being said in verse 11 because, as I pointed out last week, verse 10 is a personally important verse to me. It's one of the very first verses I ever heard preached from a Christian pulpit, and probably the verse I ever really memorized. So it was a very important verse to me. But a second thing that I discovered, and this was entirely accidental as I was working through verses 1 to 11, and particularly 9 to 11, that each of these verses needed to be addressed individually because each has enough importance and or relevance to preach by itself. Each one has a certain sense of importance to it. Verse 9, the righteousness from God, that deserves some attention. The knowing Christ in the fullest sense in verse 10, and now what we see here in verse 11. But there's a third reason, and this one caught me a little by surprise, I will confess, because I hadn't noticed this in all the time I've spent in Paul's letters and all the time I've spent in this book particularly. If you look closely at verses 9, 10, and 11, there is a chronological and soteriological order in these verses that's worth noting. I didn't really notice it before until you really start diving into a text and you spend all day, every day in a text, and you suddenly go, oh. So here's my oh. Verse 9, if you look at it, is Paul talking about a righteousness from God. I want to be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, but having a righteousness from God. You might say that that's Paul speaking of his past. Paul speaking of him receiving the righteousness of God by faith. The righteousness that he received by virtue of putting his trust in the risen Christ. We could say it's a picture of his initial conversion, in a sense. But then you move on to verse 10, and you see it speaking very much in the present. Verse 9 in the past, this is what happened to me when I received the righteousness from God. But now verse 10, a sense of Paul's present, or more specifically his sanctification. His justification in verse 9, his sanctification in verse 10, where he speaks in that verse about the transformation of truly knowing Jesus, right? That he knows the power of the resurrection, that he really understands what it means to have dominion over sin in his life. And then as he shares in the sufferings of Christ, seeing through the lens of Christ how to deal with the aspect of suffering in his own life, even as Jesus saw it. And then, of course, that final phrase, becoming like him in his death, the whole idea of being transformed. That's sanctification in a nutshell, isn't it? Knowing him through all of life and being transformed into his image. That's the very definition of sanctification. So verse 10, past tense, conversion / justification. Verse 9, Verse 10, present tense, justification, sanctification in the present. But now verse 11, future. What Paul's hoping for in the future. The eventual completion of all of what God has been doing or is doing in his life. More specifically, as he mentions the resurrection from the dead. Paul's glorification. Verse 9, his justification. Verse 10, his sanctification. Verse 11, his glorification. I don't think that's accidental. I do think Paul is speaking in that way. That I might know the righteousness of God in Christ by faith, his righteousness, not mine. that I may be sanctified in all of my life, even being transformed to the very image of Christ, and then being glorified by being raised from the dead. I don't think that's accidental. So one reason is because I wanted to preach verse 10 by itself. Another is because there's a sense of each one having enough importance in it deserves a sermon. Third is that there's a chronological / soteriological order. But there's a fourth reason I want to preach this verse by itself. And it's the most important of the three I just gave you. Because I think there is something in this verse that's ignored today. That's rarely seen or rarely discussed in Christian circles today. Rarely seen. I call it the missing element of redemption that's seen here in verse 11. And the missing element that I'm referring to is the missing element of the resurrection of the body in much of evangelical or mainline anthropology, or the view of man. Now, just as an aside, notice in verse 10, when Paul speaks of the resurrection there, in verse 10, he's speaking specifically of Jesus' resurrection, right? That I may know him and the power of his resurrection. So he's speaking of the resurrection of Christ from the dead. While verse 11, the resurrection there, the resurrection from the dead, is of a future resurrection of those who follow Christ from the dead. As Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 15:20, that Christ is the first fruits, the first one to come forth, and then there will be others that will follow. I mean, if there's first fruits, then there must be other fruits, right? And so the difference between verse 10 and 11 is talking about Jesus' resurrection, but in verse 11 he's talking about another one. He's talking about the general resurrection of the dead that occurs in the future. Now, the natural question, of course, is why? Why has this central tenet of Christianity fallen from grace, if you will? Why is it we don't talk about it anymore? Why is it that we don't see this? Why has this doctrine either been ignored or, in many ways, as I will argue going forward, that it's been transformed into what I call a spiritualized concept of us becoming nothing more than ethereal beings upon death. We get out of the body and we become, well, some sort of ethereal being. Or let's put it like this. Why is the goal of much of Christianity to get to heaven when we die? That's how it's phrased, right? We got to get people to heaven. Why is that the goal? So I think the answer to the question I'm raising here is why is that this concept of the resurrection sort of disappeared, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment, but why is it gone? And I would suggest to you that the reason why is because the Christian church in modern times has embraced a form of thinking that is intimated in, but opposite of what is spoken of in verse 10. Back in verse 10, Paul says, "Oh, that I might know him." That word is key here, because I think what we have embraced in modern Christianity is something which is known as, or what I'm going to entitle, modernized Gnosticism. Modernized Gnosticism. A quick history lesson here. Gnosticism was a late first century and mostly second and third century philosophical system which prioritized a form of knowledge some would have it, a form of knowledge that would lead to the liberation of ourselves from this body. We would get to escape from this body, having this certain knowledge. In fact, that word that Paul uses there in verse 10, "Oh, that I might know him," I said last week, remember, it's the word gnosis. It's the Greek word for knowledge. But it's knowledge, you remember I said, it's knowledge that has an effect, right? It's not just knowing something. It's knowledge that produces an effect in us. I know it, and therefore it changes me. So it's a knowledge with an understanding of deeper realities that can lead you somewhere. In the case of Gnosticism, leading you to freedom, leading you to escape. In fact, in Gnostic thinking, there was this dualistic theory that good and evil have always existed side by side. There's always been evil and there's always been good. So God represents good, and then there are other forces that represented evil. They've always stood by side, and that this world was not created by the God who is good, but rather by what is referred to as a demiurge, we call a sub-god, who formed this world, you might say, out of spite against the good God to create this world of evil, if you will. So for the Gnostics, the goal was to escape from this material world. And the way to do that was to get this special knowledge that was only available to some. And if you had this special knowledge, particularly this knowledge that physical flesh is evil and the spiritual plane is our true home, if you could get that, then you could escape, you see, if you could get this special knowledge, you see. It led to a most difficult heresy in the Christian church. And it was, this particular heresy was known as Docetism. Docetism was the ancient heresy that Jesus was not actually fully human. That the man Jesus was a vision of a human, in a sense that he appeared as human, but he really didn't have physicality. The argument of the Gnostics was, look, God would never enter into a physical world that is evil because he wouldn't do that. So Jesus coming as God, and they, again, reduced the value of Jesus as God, but the basic idea is that, well, he really wasn't God. He just kind of appeared to be so. And much like those Old Testament theophanies where God would appear, right, and wrestle with Jacob, or show up and speak with Hagar in the wilderness, or whatever, right? That's sort of a sense in which he was here but not really here. You could touch him, but it really wasn't a true human touch sort of thing. And this view of Docetism, by the way, took until the 5th century of the church to finally overcome. It took until 451 at Chalcedon for the church to finally and completely make it clear that the belief of the church is that Jesus was fully man in every sense, while also being fully God in every sense. A man walking around with flesh and blood, touchable as a human, in other words, the fullness of the incarnation that we now believe. In fact, I'm convinced, it's my opinion, that John is addressing proto-Gnosticism, an early form of this thinking, in his gospel, by at the very beginning speaking about the Word being with God and the Word becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us. Even he is addressing sort of an early version of this. Like I said, it's a late 1st century, mostly 2nd and 3rd century heresy, but there's early Greek philosophies running around with this. So it is, as I said, this Gnosticism is the opposite of Paul's knowing that he speaks of in verse 10. Remember, I argued that what Paul is saying in verse 10 is that his knowing wasn't just knowing, but his knowing was experiencing in a physical life all of what it means to know Christ. For example, not to escape from suffering, but to share in suffering in the way that Christ himself understood suffering. To share in his sufferings and become like him in his death. Those were words that Paul used to say, look, I'm not just talking about some knowledge I have in my head that I share with you, but something I experience in life. I know what it means to deal with pain and loss and grief and so forth through the lens of Christ as a physical man. So when Gnosticism began to rise up in the early centuries of the church, it infiltrated the way the church was thinking in 3 specific ways. Number one, as I said earlier, it denied that God would enter into the world and take on flesh. Right? That's where Docetism would come from. Secondly, it would minimize the importance of righteous living as human beings made in the image of God. I mean, after all, if the flesh is evil and the goal is to escape, who cares how we live in this flesh, right? That was their saying. That's what they believed. It doesn't matter how you live. The goal is to get out of here. And thirdly, it would prioritize the spiritual aspects of existence beyond this life, minimizing the realities of living in this world. It would maximize the idea of the spiritual realm over the physical realm. Now, let me ask you a question. Does that description sound familiar? Now, I don't mean in the historical sense, what Gnosticism was in the first century. Does it sound familiar in the world in which we live today? If it doesn't, you haven't been paying attention. Because there is this thing now, I'm convinced of, and many other pundits out there are saying the same thing. There's a modernized form of Gnosticism that's proliferated in the modern church. Let me give you some examples, all right? You can go to many a Christian funeral today. Now, notice I said Christian funeral. You can go to many a funeral of a person being buried who was supposedly a Christian and never hear about the resurrection when you're there. They'll talk about the wonderful life of the person and how he lived and so forth, but you never hear about the resurrection. That's odd, isn't it? Let me suggest to you today, too, that you could go to any typical Baptist. Just pick a typical Baptist out there. None in this room, okay? But out there, and ask them a simple question. Ask them, is Jesus still human today? And see what kind of puzzled look you get from the person you asked. Never really thought about that. No, couldn't be still human today. I mean, he ascended into heaven, right? And we sing all the time, since Jesus came into my heart, so he can't possibly be human. Thirdly, in many aspects of American evangelicalism, particularly since the middle part of the 20th century, the de facto eschatology has put more emphasis on the hope being the rapture rather than the resurrection. The blessed hope now isn't the resurrection. The blessed hope is one day we get out of here. We get to escape. And then, of course, there's the memology. Poor Aunt Martha did not survive her goiter surgery. Sorry to tell you that. She died. But now she's become my guardian angel. Yesterday I heard a coach in one of the football games actually say that his mother, who had died just a few months ago, she would be watching the game, but from a very different seat. And then, of course, what's the comfort we always give when somebody dies? What's the quick and easy comfort? Oh, they've gone to a better place. Are you sure about that? Because the rich man didn't go to a better place, did he? Lazarus did, but he didn't. And let me suggest, too, that there is a great deal of disconnect that happens now in the church. I'm going to get technical here for a second, but there's a great deal of disconnect of conversion from the so-called eternal hope in much of the preaching that takes place in the pulpit. We no longer, in many circles, connect justification to sanctification and glorification in the way we preach. We find many preachers who say, the goal is for you to get to heaven when you die. Come pray the prayer, believe in Jesus, and you'll be saved. And when you die, you'll go to heaven. And there's no connection from that conversion. They don't even use the word, by the way, anymore. That conversion to when you die. And everything in between is basically, who cares? You're going to go to heaven when you die. You prayed the prayer, right? There's a disconnect there. So even as Paul himself goes from justification to sanctification to glorification, a whole lot of Christian preaching is going from praying the prayer to winding up in heaven without any real discussion of what's in between. And let me also suggest that we live in a world now where the primary religion all around us is secularism. The primary religion is a religion of secularism, or the focus on the self, which has led many Christians, by virtue of being swamped in this, to respond to the idea of spiritual non-existence, because that's what seculars teach. There is no spiritual realm, and when you die, there is no existence beyond death. And so many Christians have responded to that by simply compromising. They're compromising as well. No, when we die, we go to be with God. And they don't go any further than that in the discussion. And then, unfortunately, the synergistic view of the gospel that's often professed from Christian pulpits teaches that our spirits are able to do good. We can respond to the gospel because our spirits can do good. We can believe in Jesus. Our bodies are less than what they're designed to be, right? So you have a lot of Christian preachers who speak in terms of, well, you're supposed to, believe in Jesus and then reach your fullest potential in this world. And that speaks to my thesis. And then, of course, I couldn't close this list without including, of course, the emphasis on physical happiness as the goal. For most people today, you walk into a typical Christian church and their goal is to teach you how to be happy in this world, how to just be happy in this world, to escape the physical problems into the spiritual plane where no such things can be. You see, I have 9 different reasons why we're there. Are you convinced yet? But let me share with you one more of why we don't emphasize the resurrection anymore, and this is the key. We don't emphasize the resurrection because we minimize the importance of sanctification and thus glorification to follow it. We minimize the importance of sanctification as the purpose of God saving us. Ask your typical Baptist, what is the purpose of God saving you? Why were you saved? And what answer will you get? So you get to go to heaven. But is not the Scriptures clear that the goal is for us to be transformed into the fullness of Christ? Verse 10, I offer you as my proof of this. The goal of salvation for far too many in the church today is simply to go to heaven or to be happy in this world, rather than what Paul obviously believed was important about living, according to verse 10. We live in a time when the resurrection isn't spoken of anymore because we've gotten our eyes off the goal. So Paul here is going to be speaking of the resurrection of the dead, or the way he puts it in my translation is the resurrection from the dead. The connector can be either one. So let me put it to you like this. Paul's goal was to be included in the resurrection of the elect from the dead. For him, the end goal of knowing Christ in this world culminated with him knowing Christ eternally through the resurrection. Let me say that again. Paul's goal was to be included in the resurrection of the elect from the dead. That's his goal. Or you might say, as he says in verse 9, that I may be found in him, to mean also to be found with him in his state of immortality. That's what he wants. And so let us consider what he is saying in these words. So Paul says he has a hope of attaining the resurrection, and the hope is expressed in the phrase. And this is, in English, much more verbose than it is in the Greek. He says, first of all, that by any means possible. Now, you may find this hard to believe. That entire phrase is one 3-letter word in the Greek. It's P-O-S. Pos. And it's not even a verb, it's a correlative particle. It's not even a verb or even adverb. It does have adverbial form, but it's basically expressing the idea of somehow, or how, somehow, or it's modifying the word attain, which we'll look at in a second. Attain, somehow I might attain. So in English, if you look at the various translations of this, it's like in order that, or somehow, or if possible, or assuming that I will, in different translations. So it's kind of like, it's hard to translate this word from Greek into English without using a bunch of words, because you have to express the idea of, well, I'm just hoping it's true, that somehow I'm a part of that in some way, okay? So the ESV chose by any means possible, okay? That's perfectly legitimate. It's just somehow I hope that I'm included in this. You might say it's a connector between becoming like him in verse 10 and that I may attain something in verse 11. So becoming like him in his death so that somehow I attain to the resurrection is what he's saying. Okay, don't be confused by the verse marker in there, right? There's no verses here. There's just one phrase. So somehow, I hope that I may get there. So that leads to the verb, which is that I may attain. And it literally means to get to a certain place. Arrive, reach, come to, somehow get there to a certain place, whatever that might be. The same word is used in Acts 21:7 when Luke says, when we had finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais and we greeted the brothers and stayed with them for a day. Okay, so it's just geographically getting somewhere. So it's not the idea of achieving something. It's really rather the idea of arriving somewhere, okay? And that's an important difference. You might say it's to be included in, to participate in, to be a part of. In this case, Paul's using it in the sense of to be included in something that has a definite substance or location. All right, I want to be a part of an event that someone participates in. It's not just a theoretical idea, it's an actual event. So that's why that word is being used, because it's, even as I quoted it in Acts 21, they arrived at a particular place, right? It's a physical known place and they arrived there. That's how Paul is speaking it. So it means to arrive there, but as a verb in the subjunctive form, alongside the participle somehow, the word is actually more of a probability rather than a certainty. Now that's unfortunate, the way that Paul writes that, because we would prefer it to be a certainty. In other words, that I may attain, that I may participate, okay? So Paul is using it not in the sense of absolute certainty, but he's actually using it in the sense of, well, I'm hoping to be included in something as the end result of the life described in verse 10. So it would be so much better if Paul just said, and to be included, but he uses a different word because for Paul, it's a future thing. That's why it doesn't have the certainty to it. It's certain in a sense, but it's like something you hope for, a biblical hope, right? Not the wishful thinking type of hope, but the hope for kind of thing. I'm hoping this happens. But yet it's future to me, and so it becomes something that I can simply speak of in that subjunctive sense. It's coming, and I hope to be included in it. He is not working to attain it, as I said, as if that's even possible, but to simply be included in it. I hope to be included in this thing that's coming. Out of that life I desire to know Christ, to share in his sufferings, to know the power of his resurrection, to become like him. The goal of all of that for me, my hope in all of that, is that I get included in this thing. I want to be a part of that. And of course, he speaks of it as the resurrection from the dead. Now, there's another odd thing about this verse. Paul uses the word exanastasis here, which is the only place it's used in the New Testament. For some reason, Paul decided to put the ex in front of the typical word used for resurrection, anastasis. Why he added the X is unknown. Could have been something in the first century. It could have been some understanding of the resurrection different, but I don't know, and nobody really does. What we do know is, seems reasonable that given that the substance of the word is anastasis, it's highly likely he's speaking of the resurrection. So, what is the resurrection? Well, in the simplest sense, the resurrection is the returning to life of one who is dead into a greater state of being than before. Let me say that again. The resurrection is the returning to life of one who is dead into a greater state of being than before. In the simplest sense, it is God on that particular day taking the immortal soul and placing it back into a reconstituted physical body. Bringing forth a physical body and placing the immortal soul of that individual back into that physical body after the physical body has died and the immortal soul has returned to God. 2 Corinthians 5:18, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So the soul, the immortal part of us, returns to the Lord upon death. Resurrection is the restoration of that immortal soul into a physical body. We note that Paul explicitly refers to this as resurrection from the dead. Okay? This is not a description of the rapture. This is a description of a whole lot of dead people being raised up physically and having their immortal souls returned to a physical body. I would say, for me, the best way that I understand it is, in a sense, God redoing what he did in the initial formation of Adam in the garden. What did God do first? He took dust from the ground and formed it. And then he breathed into the dust such that it became a living being. What was created first? Our body, or the body of Adam. And so resurrection is the same picture. It's God reconstituting a body for us and then putting our immortal soul, all of what we are in our unique nature as a human being made in the image of God, and he puts it back into this physical body. Now, this physical body, though, is more than just simple resuscitation. Lazarus was not resurrected. Lazarus was simply resuscitated back to life. As far as we know, Lazarus died again, didn't he? Later. Because nobody is claiming to be Lazarus today on this planet, right? Nobody's ever heard of Lazarus. He died again. So he was not resurrected. He may have been resurrected in the technical sense of God returning his immortal soul to his physical body, but not in a glorified sense. Because if it had been glorified, he'd live forever. No, he's not. So it's more than just resuscitation. It's the coming to life by the power of God, whereby one is raised glorified. That means into a greater state than what we were before we were alive. And of course, the best example of this is our Lord himself, who was resurrected, right? He was the first fruits. He's the first to walk out of a tomb. Paul makes a very big deal about this in 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus was resurrected into a state much greater and yet similar to himself. They recognized him, and yet they didn't recognize him. He ate a fish and walked through a door. Okay, so he was similar and dissimilar. I'll come back to that in a minute. So in this case, Paul is clearly assuming a resurrection into something greater than his current life. He wants to be included in something greater than having to go through an eternity of suffering or an eternity of transformation, right? Little by little. He's hoping to be included in something that will finish of what he is speaking of in verse 10. It brings it to its culmination. And that, of course, is his glorification, where he is raised from the dead into a greater state of immortality than he had prior to that. Now, in the Old Testament, prior to the prophets, there is scant teaching regarding the resurrection of the body. There's not a lot in the Old Testament regarding resurrection of the body. No nation around Israel ever possessed such a belief. And so for Israel, even the sort of rudimentary sense of it that came in Israel would have had to come by revelation. God would have had to have revealed it to them. The writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 11:19 tells us how it was that Abraham could understand the seeming contradiction between Isaac being the child of the child in which a nation would come, and yet at the same time God telling him, go kill him. And the writer of Hebrews tells us that Abraham believed that God could raise him from the dead. So there's a proto sense of resurrection in the Old Testament, but it's not very well fleshed out. You can hunt the Old Testament hard and you'll find very little about the resurrection of the body. Most of the discussion is simply about the righteous going away to the place of righteousness and the wicked going away to the place of unrighteousness, but there's really not any discussion of resurrection per se. Now, Jesus does intimate that the concept existed in the thinking of ancient Israel in somewhat infant form when he told those who were listening to him, when he compared, I should say, Exodus 3:6, or when he spoke of Exodus 3:6, when he said that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. So he speaks of a sense of this grand immortality. But even then, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not yet raised from the dead. They're alive, but they're not yet there. So there's an infant seed of that there, but it's never really fleshed out. And where does it get known? And the answer is when Jesus himself walks forth from a tomb on a Sunday morning. Even he teaches it, right? After 3 days, I will rise again. He teaches the concept very clearly in Matthew 22. You see it in John 5, 6, 11, 14, 17. Even in his great high priestly prayer, you see intimations of it. Jesus is the one that introduces the idea of this idea of resurrection. The physical resurrection of Jesus, which was witnessed, and that's important, was witnessed, becomes the basis for the church. It becomes the basis for the church. It becomes the basis, it becomes the foundation of the church itself. The nature of Jesus' own resurrection becomes the basis for understanding it amongst those joined to him in his body, which we call the mystical union, those of us who belong to this Christ. The picture of the body that's painted in the New Testament is not the picture of a dead body that we're included in, but the picture of a risen body that we're in. As we have been raised from the dead, spiritually now included in his physical body, where he is the head having been raised, we too being included. But the goal isn't for us just to be included in his body in some sort of mystical way. We want to be included literally. How? In being raised. In being physically brought back to our human state with an immortal soul and an immortal body. That's what is spoken of in this idea of Jesus, of us being the body of Christ. And the New Testament apostles speak of it as vital to their view of salvation. Paul does all over the place. 1 Corinthians 15, of course, is a grand chapter on the subject. 2 Corinthians 5, 1 Thessalonians 4, Revelation 20. You have a lot of this idea of us coming to life again as human. Not just as ethereal beings floating around in some sort of spiritual world, but rather being raised up to receive again our bodies with our justified souls now placed into our glorified eternal bodies. And there is continuity and discontinuity between the resurrected body and the current one. The continuity is that this resurrected body will be physical in nature. It will have the same kinds of attributes that humans possess now, and we can see that based on Jesus after his resurrection, right? He was breathing and eating and speaking and hearing and being visible. He had the ability to walk. He was recognizable as human. I mean, you go through the accounts of Jesus, it's clear that he was human and they recognized him as such. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't think they were talking to a specter. They thought they were talking to a man who was talking to them and talking about all of what he was all about. And then when he broke bread at the table, they recognized him. Oh, hey, I recognize you. And boom, he was gone. There's continuity there. Because remember, my friends, being human presupposes you have a physical nature. That's the part that's missing in most evangelical preaching. Which part of Adam was created first? Which part did God make first? He made bodies for us. We are human when we are embodied creatures. We are embodied, and that's what makes us physical beings. That's what makes us human. So, being human presupposes a physicality. So there's continuity in the resurrection to what we are, but there's discontinuity. Yet having certain attributes beyond the scope of our current state of being, again implied from Jesus' post-resurrection nature. Perfect health, heightened physical and intellectual abilities, no longer held back by corruption. Greater intellectual ability or physicality without the corruption of sin. I mean, imagine what your brain could do. Okay, imagine what my brain could do if I wasn't corrupted by sin. In fact, Paul describes this continuity and discontinuity thoroughly in 1 Corinthians 15, 35 to 49. I won't quote it all. Go read it. But Paul makes very clear what is sown perishable is raised imperishable. What is sown mortal is raised immortal, and so on. He gives these discontinuities. Continuity and discontinuity. Being human, physical. Being glorified, perfect physically. In other words, for the elect, we're talking about a perfection of physical nature beyond even what Adam experienced in his primordial state. Now, there's some debate over that, but I'm absolutely convinced, that Adam was in a morally neutral place, but we will be in a morally glorified place. It's different. I think we'll be greater than what Adam was. I think we'll be remade into the fullness of the Imago Dei, such that no concupiscence of the flesh will continue to exist in us. There'll be no inclination to corruption of any kind, moral, physical, intellectually, emotionally, etc. I think that's far greater than what Adam was made. But even if we're the same as what Adam was, it's still going to be much better than we are now, right? So Paul speaks of resurrection as this: God giving us back our physical bodies, glorified bodies, to live in forever as human beings made in his image. But there's an article in front of the word resurrection here. The resurrection. Okay, so that changes the meaning slightly. If we understand what resurrection means, we mean that, but the resurrection is an event. So the resurrection, as Paul would understand it here, is the event at the second coming of Jesus, whereby all men are raised up physically, as I just said. And they are raised up physically to stand before him in judgment and then to live eternally in that new state. We would say that the literal resurrection of Jesus points to him as the first fruits of everybody else coming forward. So there's coming a day when he is going to sound the trump and everybody is going to come from the grave, and God is going to reconstitute bodies for all of us and put our immortal souls back into those bodies. Now, Paul's view here in verse 11 is undoubtedly the resurrection of the elect, okay? Because he wants to be included in it. Okay, so I can't imagine Paul wanting to be included in a resurrection where all of those that are raised wind up somewhere other than the presence of God, right? Okay, so he's talking about that by any means possible I may attain to the resurrection of, or from the dead of the elect. But there is also a resurrection of those who are not elect. They're also included in this resurrection. All men are going to be raised to a state of humanity, to a state of physicality, all human beings. Now, what the Scripture doesn't really tell us much of is the state of the reprobate in their immortal, as immortally embodied. It doesn't tell us much about that. But I would put it like this. The reprobate, those who are in rebellion against God, will experience in their immortal embodied state the results of their rebellion against God. In Revelation 21:8, it speaks of the second death, and I'm convinced that what that's referring to is being raised into a body that experiences death constantly. Now, I don't know how to explain that. I don't think anybody does. And I shudder at the thought, to be honest with you. But it's a body that is not glorified in the sense of being filled with life, but rather a body that is filled with death. The continuing rebellion of the reprobate against God and their natural state, their physical state, is a state of death whereby their continuing rejection of God's law produces in them every form of corruption, including a permanent hardening of their hearts. Without the grace of God, none of us would be able to overcome our hard hearts, correct? Our hardened hearts are taken out of us by the mercy of God. He takes out of us the heart of stone and puts in a heart of flesh. But for the reprobate, he leaves them in that state. He passes over them by his grace and leaves them in that state, and they become hardened against God. Now imagine an eternity of people without the grace of God, living in a state of death in their constant rebellion against God. By the way, if you don't understand why hell is eternal, that's why. Hell is eternal because it is an eternal state of human beings continuing to reject God's law and continuing to rebel against Him. Who came up with this idea that people stop sinning once they die? Who came up with that? No, the reprobate will continue to sin, rebel against the law of God. The way James White put it some time ago, he said you could take a man out of hell 10,000 years after he's been there, set him in a chair, he's still smoking from being in that place, and say to him, will you now submit yourself to the law of God? And that man will get up and walk right back into hell because he stands in utter rebellion against God's law. What does he want? What does he absolutely demand? That he be God. And he will never have that satisfied. And so it'll be a place where they too are raised bodily to experience in their physicality what death means. Which seems to me like a really good reason to run to Christ, don't you think? I mean, if you have any hint at all of that, then you should run to Christ and throw yourself at the foot of the cross and beg for mercy that He does not include you in that. That's the heart of the gospel. Come to Him and He will save you from that. The reprobate will rise to destruction, but the elect will rise unto eternal life. They will rise, and their bodies will not be filled with death. Their bodies will be filled with life. Eternal life. Glorious life. Immortality, of which Paul hopes to be included. He wants to be included in the glorification of the saints. That's what he wants to be included of. Now, when exactly is this going to occur? Who knows? Depends on the last book you read, determines your eschatology, right? Let me just put it to you this way. The great confessions of the faith, including the 1699 Confession, represent the resurrection of the body, that event to be simultaneous with the return of Christ and the judgment. They don't separate the events, and the confessions don't take any view of the millennium. Christ is coming back. He's going to raise all men to physicality, and then they're all going to stand before him in judgment. Those three facts are undeniable, regardless of what your eschatological position would be. So here is Paul in verse 11 saying, I desire to become like Christ now, which means I hope it will culminate in my inclusion in the resurrection. Becoming like him in his death, and thus becoming like him in his resurrection, in his life. I want to be like him. I want to be completely like him. I want to be all that God intended for me to be as a human, and I want that to be just like Christ. So, let me ask you a question this morning. What makes this resurrection Paul's hope? Or ours? What makes the resurrection our hope? Why is it imperative that Paul be resurrected physically, culminating in his knowing Christ? Okay, so a perfectly legitimate question would be, well, wait, wouldn't it be just fine for us to just be out of the body and just be like ethereal beings, where we're just like angels floating around in the spiritual realm, right? Wouldn't that just be fine? Okay, perfectly legitimate question. And I say, no, it's not. Not even close. To just be a little angel floating in heaven, playing your harp on a cloud somewhere, okay, is not the goal. It's not the hope. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. Number 1, because what it means to be human is to have a physical body. All right, I said that earlier. I'm repeating it again. To be human means we have physicality. I know you when I see your face. Right? I look at your face. I go, hey, I know that guy. Or sometimes it's like, I think I know that guy. But we recognize each other. Why? Because we start with the physical. Right? To be human, according to Scripture, is to be people of physicality. We have a body. God created Adam's body first, and then he put an immortal soul into us. He's going to do the same for us again. He's going to give us back our physicality. Now, the wonderful thing about that body is it's going to be glorious and immortal. Now, don't ask me what it's going to look like. Don't ask me what age it's going to be. I know some of you are just desperate for me to answer that question, right? I do have a theory. I do believe you can be in the glorified body whatever age you want. But that's just a speculation. I have no scriptural support for that whatsoever. But that's what I'm kind of hoping. Because I think you can kind of see it in yourself, right? Those of us who have white hair, right? Do we see ourselves as old as we really are? We don't, do we? I'm still 38. Now, to your perspective, I look like 86, but I'm actually 38, right? I think I can make an argument that might work in the physical body, but I can't prove it. Here's what I know. To be human requires physicality. We must have bodies. That's what we need to be. And so God is going to raise us again. But a second reason is this. If you're going to come at the issue of salvation from a biblical perspective, you have to recognize that the resurrection of Jesus is his victory over death. And that's what we should want. Victory over death. Not just escape from the body. That's not victory over death. That's just escapism. No, what we should want is to live in glorified bodies as He gives them to us, so that there's no threat of death again. I don't know about you, but I want to live in a body where I can walk around and go, you know what? Don't ask me how old I am, because it doesn't matter. Because I'm going to live forever. So who cares how old I am? This is what Paul means when he says in 1 Corinthians 15:54 and 55, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? I want to say that in a body. I want to be able to walk around and go, death, you're done. It's over. Where is your victory? Where is your sting? When Paul writes those words in there, he's writing the words of the glorified that are going to say that. That's what we should want. To truly live in our physical bodies as human beings, without fear, without pain, without grief, without loss, to experience the fullness of life everlasting that we never saw here. What's James's hope as he's laying in that hospital bed fighting for his life? What's his hope? His hope that God is going to give him another body that's going to be perfect. And that should be our hope as well. Not simply to escape from the body, but to get one that's perfect, glorified. To experience the fullness of life everlasting we never saw here. But let me give you a third reason. I found this kind of clever. Where in the Bible does it ever show angels building things, inventing things, creating things? Does it? I must confess, I may be missing one or two. But I searched the scriptures over. I can't find a single place where angelic beings come and build a tower or build a house or invent a car or build a Walmart and fill it up with stuff. And you all laugh because you think, Walmart. Personally, I think graduating from this body into some sort of angelic thing would be boring. Boring. Because God has given to us, as creatures made in His image, the ability to create ourselves. We have the ability to build. I've told you this story, right? I'm absolutely amazed every time I walk into a Walmart. Not because of the people that are there, but because of the things that are on the shelf. Somebody had to think that up. Somebody had to produce it. Somebody had to ship it. Somebody had to put it there. It's unbelievable, the kinds of things that are there. I went to Walmart the other day and bought a 43-inch LCD TV for $168. What? And it was like 2 pounds. It's like, whoa. I remember when 43 inches in a tube TV would weigh a ton. The very first the very first LCD monitor I ever saw, we saw at a computer shop back in the 90s, was $10,000. Today I bought it, same idea, for $168. Human beings did that. They figured that out. They created it. They built it. They delivered it to you, and it's hanging on the wall in my house. And all of us have one. We build. We create. We form. Because God has taken His infinite creativity and put it in us as physical creatures. And I'm convinced that the resurrection is God raising us from the dead so that we can go and explore the creative aspect of the Imago Dei given to us by an infinitely creative God. We have no idea what is out there that we might go and see and explore and use to build. We have no idea. Man has not heard, and no mind has conceived what God has in store for us, right? We are physical creatures, and when our glorified bodies come, look out. We will be able to glorify our God and worship Him in ways unimaginable to us today, because all of our creativity is going to be simply to worship Him, to honor Him. So the true goal of the Christian is to be included in the resurrection of the dead, to be glorified bodily as the end result of knowing Christ in this world, to enjoy a state of perfect immortality, originally corrupted by Adam, but fully restored when the trumpet sounds and the dead are raised. Or as Paul says in verse 10, to be found in Him in His state of immortality. That's what we want. That's our hope. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our justification, our sanctification, and our glorification.